It is 323 BC, and the most powerful man in the known world is dying. He is 32 years old. He has never lost a battle. He commands an empire that stretches from Greece to the edges of India, covering over 2 million square miles of territory. Kings have knelt before him. Cities have surrendered at the mere rumor of his approach. Priests in Egypt called him a god. Oracles declared him invincible, and now he lies in a palace in Babylon, burning with fever, unable to lift his head from the pillow. His generals crowd around the bed, their faces unreadable. These are men who have marched with him through burning deserts, across frozen mountain passes, through monsoon rains at the edge of the world. They have watched him charge into battle at the front of the line, take arrows in the chest, take a sword through the lung, and walk away. They have followed him because they believed, truly believed, that he could not be stopped. But in the silence of that room, as the fever climbs and the breath grows shallow, a terrible question begins to form. Not the question of whether Alexander will survive. By now, most of them already know the answer to that. The question is, what happens next? He built the largest empire the Western world had ever seen in just 13 years, and he left no plan for what would come after. That question, what happens when the conqueror is gone, would tear his world apart within a generation. It would produce 50 years of war, the deaths of nearly everyone he loved, and the fracture of his empire into pieces that would never be reassembled. But to understand how it all collapsed, you first have to understand how one young man from a small northern kingdom managed to conquer most of the known world in the first place. And that story begins not in a palace and not on a battlefield. It begins in a classroom. Philip II of Macedon was not supposed to be a world historical figure. Macedon, the kingdom he inherited in 359 BC, was a rough, semi-peripheral state on the northern edge of the Greek world. The polished city-states to the south, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, looked down on Macedonians as barely civilized. They spoke a dialect that sounded coarse to Athenian ears. Their kings drank heavily and settled disputes with a directness that the sophisticated south found barbaric. But Philip was something unusual. He had spent time as a hostage in Thebes as a young man, and while there he had studied the most advanced military thinking of the age under the general Epaminondas, the man who had shattered Spartan dominance at the Battle of Leuctra. Philip absorbed everything, and when he returned to Macedon and took the throne at 23, in a kingdom surrounded by enemies, he immediately began to transform what he had learned into something new. He reorganized the Macedonian army around a formation called the phalanx, but he made it deeper, tighter, and more lethal than anything the Greeks had used before. His soldiers carried a weapon called the sarissa, a pike roughly 18 feet long, so long that the men in the back ranks could extend their weapons past the men in the front. From the outside, a Macedonian phalanx looked like a moving wall of spear points. It was nearly impossible to break from the front, but Philip understood that the phalanx alone was not enough. It was powerful but slow, and it needed protection on its flanks, so he built his cavalry into a strike force of exceptional quality, and he developed tactics that combined the two. The phalanx would hold and press the enemy infantry, fix them in place, absorb their attention, and then the cavalry would sweep around the side and hit them where they were weakest. It was a hammer and anvil strategy, and in Philip's hands it was devastatingly effective. Within 20 years, Philip had turned Macedon from a vulnerable backwater into the dominant power in Greece. He did it through war, through diplomacy, through strategic marriage, and through a ruthless willingness to exploit his enemies' weaknesses. By 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, he crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes and became effectively the master of the Greek world. He was planning to go further. He had his eyes on Persia, the great empire to the east that had twice invaded Greece and that represented in the Greek imagination the ultimate prize. Philip had already sent an advance force across the Hellespont when in 336 BC he was assassinated at his own daughter's wedding. The killer was one of his own bodyguards. The motives behind the assassination have been debated ever since. Some ancient sources hint at a conspiracy involving Philip's estranged wife Olympias, the mother of his eldest son. Others suggest it was a personal grievance. The truth is that we do not know with certainty, and any confident claim about who was ultimately responsible should be treated with skepticism. What we do know is that the throne passed to that eldest son. His name was Alexander. He was 20 years old. Alexander had been prepared for this moment his entire life, though perhaps not in the ways you might expect. He had been educated by Aristotle. Let that land for a moment. The most famous philosopher in the ancient world, the man who essentially invented the disciplines of biology, logic, ethics, political science, and literary criticism, was Alexander's personal tutor from the age of 13 to 16. Aristotle taught him rhetoric, philosophy, medicine, and science. He gave him a love of Homer that Alexander would carry for the rest of his life. According to ancient sources, Alexander slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, annotated by Aristotle himself, alongside a dagger. This is one of the remarkable facts about Alexander that tends to get lost in the military narrative. He was genuinely intellectually curious. He brought scientists and scholars on his campaigns. He sent botanical and zoological specimens back to Aristotle. He was fascinated by the cultures he encountered and, to an extent unusual for a conqueror, genuinely interested in understanding them rather than simply destroying them. But he was also, from an early age, intensely competitive, physically fearless, and possessed of an almost messianic sense of destiny. His mother, Olympias, told him he was descended from Achilles on her side and Heracles on his father's. She may also have told him, though this is legend and should be treated as such, that his true father was not Philip but Zeus himself. Whether Alexander believed this literally or used it as political theatre is a question historians have argued about for centuries. What is clear is that from the moment he took the throne, he moved with extraordinary speed and confidence. Within 2 years, he had secured Macedon's northern borders, crushed a rebellion in Greece with a ferocity that shocked his enemies. He destroyed the city of Thebes almost entirely, selling its population into slavery as a warning to anyone else considering revolt, and crossed into Asia with an army of roughly 40,000 men. His stated mission was to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor from Persian rule and to avenge the Persian invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier. Whether he truly intended to stop there, or whether he already had larger ambitions, is another question that historians debate. Given what followed, the second option seems more likely. The Persian Empire he was marching against was, by any measure, enormous. It stretched from Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean all the way to modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. It had a population in the tens of millions. Its king, Darius III, commanded resources and manpower that dwarfed anything Alexander could put in the field. On paper, this should not have been a contest. The first major engagement came at the Granicus River in 334 BC, and it set the template for almost everything that followed. The Persian commanders arrayed their cavalry along the far bank of the river, expecting the Macedonians to hesitate at the crossing. Alexander did not hesitate. He led the charge himself, into the river, up the far bank, directly into the heaviest fighting. He nearly died. A Persian nobleman named Spithridates came within inches of splitting his skull with a sword and was killed only because one of Alexander's companions, Cleotus the Black, cut off his arm at the last moment. This was not recklessness, or at least not only recklessness. It was a calculated statement. Alexander understood that his authority rested on his men's belief in him, and that belief required him to be visibly, undeniably brave. A king who led from the rear was a king whose men might begin to wonder. A king who led from the front, who bled alongside them, who was seen in the thick of the worst fighting, that king inspired a different kind of loyalty. He won at the Granicus. He moved through Asia Minor, liberating Greek cities, some of which opened their gates to him with genuine enthusiasm. He reached the legendary site of Troy and made offerings at the tomb of Achilles, his personal hero. He was 22 years old and already acting as if he were living inside an epic. The real test came the following year at a narrow coastal pass called Issus in what is now southern Turkey. Darius III himself commanded the Persian army, and the army was enormous. Ancient sources give wildly inflated numbers, but modern historians estimate somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 men, facing Alexander's 40,000 or so. The Persians had chosen the location poorly, however. The narrow terrain negated their numerical advantage, and Alexander's tactical genius, combined with the raw shock power of the Macedonian cavalry, shattered the Persian line. Darius fled the battlefield. He left behind his mother, his wife, his daughters, and his treasury. This is one of the moments that reveals something important about Alexander. He treated Darius's captured family with complete respect. He assured them they would be treated as royalty. He visited them personally and, according to ancient sources, was moved by their distress. Whether this was genuine compassion or shrewd political theatre or both, it became one of the defining stories of his campaign. After Issus, Alexander did something unexpected. Instead of chasing Darius into the heart of Persia, he turned south. He spent the next year and a half securing the eastern Mediterranean coast, Phoenicia, the Levant, Egypt, cutting off the Persian fleet from its home ports and ensuring that his supply lines were protected. It was strategically brilliant, and it required enormous patience from a man who was not known for patience. The siege of Tyre was the most dramatic episode of this phase. Tyre was an island city connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway, and its inhabitants were confident it could not be taken. Alexander built a mole, an artificial land bridge across the water to reach the walls. It took 7 months. The Tyrians destroyed his siege equipment, killed his engineers, and fought with desperate ingenuity. Alexander kept building. When the walls finally fell, he was reportedly furious at the cost and the delay, and his treatment of the city was harsh. Thousands killed, thousands more sold into slavery. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge something that a responsible account of Alexander's life must not avoid. He was capable of extraordinary generosity and genuine magnanimity. He was also capable of terrible violence, and the line between the two was often drawn by whether his enemies had submitted or resisted. Cities that surrendered were generally treated well. Cities that resisted were often treated with a severity that by any measure was brutal. This is not an anachronistic judgment. Some of his own contemporaries found it troubling. Egypt welcomed him. The Persian governors who had ruled there were not beloved, and Alexander arrived presenting himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. The Egyptian priests recognized him as pharaoh. He visited the oracle of Zeus Ammon at the Siwa oasis, deep in the desert, a journey that nearly killed his party, and the oracle reportedly confirmed his divine parentage. What exactly was said at Siwa? Alexander never fully disclosed, but he came back changed, or at least behaved as if he had. He founded Alexandria in Egypt before leaving. It was not the first city he had named after himself, and it would not be the last, but this one would become the greatest. He chose the site himself, walked the perimeter, and laid out the basic plan. Within a generation, it would grow into one of the most important cities in the ancient world, a center of trade, scholarship, and culture that would outlast his empire by centuries. The Library of Alexandria, which would eventually house hundreds of thousands of scrolls, was built there. The intellectual life of the Hellenistic world would be centered there. It is in many ways Alexander's most durable achievement. He left Egypt in 331 BC and finally turned east to face Darius again. The decisive battle came at Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq. Darius had spent the intervening years rebuilding his army, and this time he had chosen the battlefield carefully, a wide, flat plain where his numerical advantage could be fully deployed. He had scythed chariots, war elephants, and cavalry from across the empire. By any reasonable assessment, he should have won. The battle began with the Persians trying to outflank the Macedonian line on both sides. Alexander responded with a maneuver of extraordinary boldness. He led his companion cavalry in an oblique charge toward the center of the Persian line, creating a gap between his own units that the Persians began to pour through, which meant they were now attacking his camp and baggage train rather than his main force. A lesser general might have panicked. Alexander kept driving toward the center, toward Darius himself. Darius broke. For the second time, the great king of Persia turned and fled the battlefield. The Persian Empire, for practical purposes, ceased to exist that day. Its capital cities, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, fell to Alexander in quick succession. At Persepolis, the ancient ceremonial capital, Alexander allowed or ordered the burning of the great palace of Xerxes, the king who had burned Athens a century and a half before. Ancient sources disagree about whether this was a deliberate act of symbolic vengeance or a drunken accident. The palace burned regardless. He found Darius's body in the summer of 330 BC, abandoned by his own generals, stabbed in a cart in the desert. Alexander reportedly covered the body with his own cloak and sent it back to Persepolis for a royal burial. He then declared himself the legitimate successor to the Persian throne and began deliberately and systematically to present himself as a Persian king as much as a Macedonian one. This decision would create enormous tension with his own men. The campaigns that followed through Central Asia, into what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, and finally into India, were the hardest of Alexander's career. The easy conquests were behind him, What lay ahead was something different. A grinding, years-long counterinsurgency through mountainous terrain against enemies who would not stand and fight in open battle, who melted into the hills and struck at night and refused to be definitively defeated. The resistance in Bactria and Sogdia, led by a local nobleman named Spitamenes, lasted nearly 3 years. Alexander founded cities, garrisoned them, married a local woman named Roxane, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman, in what was either a genuine love match or a calculated political alliance or both. His men grew exhausted and homesick. The victories kept coming, but they felt less and less like victories. And the tensions within his own camp began to surface. There had always been a question at the heart of Alexander's project. Was he a Macedonian king who had conquered Persia, or was he something new, a king of a mixed empire who stood above ethnic distinctions? As he moved east, he increasingly behaved like the latter. He adopted Persian dress. He introduced Persian court ceremonial, including the practice of proskynesis, a bow or prostration before the king, which was standard Persian protocol, but which Greeks and Macedonians found deeply offensive, associating it with the kind of submission owed to gods, not men. His veterans were troubled. They had followed him because he was one of them, a Macedonian, a soldier, a man who drank and fought alongside them. Now he seemed to be becoming something else. The tensions boiled over in a series of incidents that reveal the darker aspects of Alexander's character. At a drinking party in 328 BC, one of his oldest companions, Cleitus the Black, the same man who had saved his life at the Granicus, made cutting remarks about Alexander's pretensions to divine status and his adoption of Persian customs. The argument escalated. Alexander, drunk and furious, grabbed a spear and killed him. He was immediately overcome with remorse. Ancient sources describe him prostrate with grief, refusing to eat or drink for days. But Cleitus was dead, and the act could not be undone. The following year, a conspiracy was uncovered among the royal pages, young Macedonian noblemen who served in the court. The details are murky, and the ancient sources are contradictory. But the result was that Philotas, the commander of the companion cavalry and the son of Alexander's most senior general Parmenion, was accused of knowing about the conspiracy and failing to report it. He was tried, tortured, and executed. Alexander then sent orders for Parmenion, who was hundreds of miles away, commanding a garrison, to be killed as well, before news of his son's execution could reach him. Parmenion had served Philip for decades. He was the most experienced general in the Macedonian army. He had not been accused of anything. These incidents, Cleitus, Philotas, Parmenion, are uncomfortable to reckon with. They do not fit the heroic narrative neatly. They suggest a man under enormous psychological pressure, increasingly isolated, increasingly unwilling to tolerate dissent, and capable of actions that even his admirers struggle to justify. The India campaign, which began in 327 BC, was in some ways the most extraordinary of all. Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush, descended into the Punjab, and won a remarkable victory at the Battle of the Hydaspes River against the Indian king Porus. Porus fought with war elephants, animals that could terrify horses and break infantry formations, and his army was formidable. Alexander adapted his tactics, found ways to neutralize the elephants, and won, but his treatment of Porus afterward was notably generous. He restored him to his kingdom as a vassal, apparently impressed by the king's dignity in defeat. He pushed further east, and then, at the Hyphasis River, the modern Beas, in what is now the Indian state of Punjab, his army stopped. They had been marching for 8 years. They were thousands of miles from home. They had heard rumors of even larger kingdoms further east, and they did not want to go. Alexander's generals, led by a man named Quirinus, told him plainly that the men would not advance. Quirinus, who had been loyal for years, gave an impassioned speech about the limits of human endurance. He died of illness shortly afterward, of natural causes as far as we know, though the timing has always seemed pointed. Alexander, by ancient accounts, was furious. He sulked in his tent for 3 days. He made offerings and consulted omens, which conveniently came back unfavorable for crossing. And then he turned back. It was the only retreat of his career, and it was not really a retreat. His army simply refused to go further. But it was a moment of profound significance. For the first time, the will of the conqueror had met a limit that was not military but human. The return journey was catastrophic. Alexander chose to lead part of his army through the Gedrosian Desert, a vast waterless wasteland in what is now southern Pakistan and Iran, in what may have been a deliberate attempt to match the legendary hardships of earlier commanders who had tried and failed to cross it. The army suffered terribly. Thousands died of thirst and heat. It remains one of the most controversial decisions of his career, and one for which no entirely satisfactory explanation has been given. He reached Babylon in the spring of 323 BC, and by all accounts he was planning something new. There were reports of preparations for a naval expedition around Arabia. There were rumors of campaigns in the western Mediterranean. His mind was still moving, still projecting forward, still imagining the next conquest. He was 32 years old and appeared to have no intention of stopping, and then he fell ill. The ancient sources describe a banquet, heavy drinking, a fever that appeared the next day and never broke. He grew progressively weaker over 12 days. By the end, he could barely speak. When his soldiers, anxious and frightened, were allowed to file past his bed, he reportedly acknowledged each of them with his eyes, unable to lift his head. When asked to whom he left his empire, he is said to have answered, though this may be a later invention, to the strongest, or perhaps to the best. The Greek word kratisto can mean either. He died on June 10th or 11, 323 BC. The cause of his death has been debated ever since. Ancient sources mention typhoid fever, possibly complicated by heavy drinking and the accumulated toll of his wounds. Some modern researchers have suggested West Nile virus. A minority have argued for poisoning, though the evidence is thin. The most likely answer, based on the symptom descriptions that survive, points toward typhoid, but certainty is not possible at this distance. He left behind an empire with no clear succession plan, a pregnant wife, and a group of generals who had spent years competing for his favor. The results were exactly as catastrophic as you would expect. Here is the wow fact that tends to stop people cold. Within 20 years of Alexander's death, virtually everyone he had loved or trusted was dead, killed not by foreign enemies but by each other. His mother Olympias was executed. His wife Roxane was murdered. His son Alexander IV, born after his death, was killed as a teenager to prevent him from ever claiming the throne. His half-brother Philip Aridaeus, who had briefly been named co-king, was also killed. His closest generals turned on each other in a series of wars that lasted, with interruptions, for about 50 years. These wars are called the Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors, and they are among the most complex and bloody conflicts in ancient history. The men fighting them were extraordinary: Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, Cassander, Eumenes. Each of them had served Alexander. Each of them believed, with some justification, that he was the man best qualified to hold the empire together. None of them succeeded. What emerged from the wreckage, by roughly 275 BC, was a new political map of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. Ptolemy and his descendants ruled Egypt from Alexandria. The Seleucids controlled a vast but loosely held territory stretching from Syria through Persia and into Central Asia. Macedon itself fell to the Antigonid dynasty. These three major successor kingdoms, along with smaller states carved out of the edges of Alexander's empire, would define the political landscape of the Hellenistic world for the next 2 centuries. They were all, in different ways, shaped by Alexander's legacy. They all claimed to be his heirs. They all used Greek as their administrative language and spread Greek culture, Greek urban planning, and Greek intellectual life across territories that had never seen them before. The cities Alexander founded, there were reportedly over 70 of them, though many were small military outposts, became centers of this cultural diffusion. This is the second wow fact: Alexander's conquests produced one of the most remarkable cultural fusions in human history. Greek, Persian, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Indian ideas, art forms, and religious concepts began to mix in ways they never had before. The philosophical schools that emerged in the Hellenistic period, Stoicism, Epicureanism, were shaped by encounters with Eastern thought. The art of the period shows a new naturalism and emotional expressiveness that would directly influence Roman art and, through it, the entire Western artistic tradition. The city of Alexandria in Egypt became the intellectual capital of the world. Its library, its museum, which was essentially the first research institution in history, and its community of scholars attracted the greatest minds of the age. Euclid worked there. Archimedes studied there. Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, was its chief librarian. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, was produced there. This single institution, born from Alexander's conquest, shaped the transmission of knowledge for centuries. The third wow fact is perhaps the most unexpected. Alexander's conquests helped create the conditions for the spread of early Christianity. This is not a simple or direct causal claim, and it requires careful handling. But consider the chain of consequences. Alexander's conquests spread the Greek language across the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. That Greek became the common language of educated people across an enormous territory, what historians call the koine, the common tongue. When the early Christian communities began writing down their scriptures and letters in the 1st century AD, they wrote in Greek, not Aramaic or Hebrew, because Greek was the language that could reach the widest audience. The New Testament is written in Greek. Paul's letters traveled across a network of cities, many of them founded or refounded by Alexander and his successors, connected by roads, sea routes, and a shared linguistic culture that Alexander's campaigns had done much to create. The Roman Empire, which eventually adopted Christianity as its state religion, was itself deeply shaped by Hellenistic culture. The Romans conquered the Greek world militarily, but were conquered by it culturally, as the Roman poet Horace famously observed. The philosophical and theological vocabulary of early Christianity, logos, pneuma, the concepts used to articulate ideas about God, soul, and salvation, came from Greek philosophy. And Greek philosophy had been transformed by its encounter with the wider world that Alexander opened up. None of this was Alexander's intention. He was not trying to create the conditions for a new religion, but history rarely moves in straight lines, and the consequences of great events extend far beyond anything their architects could have foreseen. What, then, do we make of Alexander himself? He is one of those historical figures who tends to provoke strong reactions, and those reactions often say as much about the person reacting as about the man himself. Some see him as the greatest military genius in history, a visionary who dreamed of uniting humanity across cultural boundaries. Others see him as a ruthless conqueror whose campaigns caused enormous suffering and whose vision of cultural fusion was largely a tool of domination dressed up in philosophical language. Both of these views contain truth. The difficulty is holding them simultaneously. He was genuinely brilliant as a tactician, as a strategist, and as a political operator. His ability to adapt to new terrain, new enemies, and new challenges was remarkable. He never lost a battle, which is extraordinary over a campaign of 13 years across such varied conditions. He had a gift for inspiring loyalty that bordered on the supernatural. Men followed him to the edge of the known world because they believed in him personally. He was also capable of cruelty, of paranoia, and of decisions that cost thousands of lives for reasons that were as much about his own ego and sense of destiny as about any coherent strategic goal. The Gedrosian Desert March, the destruction of Thebes, the killing of Parmenion, these are not footnotes. And the empire he built collapsed almost immediately after his death, which raises a question worth sitting with. What exactly did he build? The physical empire was temporary. It fragmented within a generation, but the cultural and intellectual consequences were lasting and profound. The Hellenistic world he created, that fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures, shaped the Roman Empire, which shaped medieval Europe, which shaped the modern West. The Greek language he spread became the vehicle for the New Testament. The cities he founded became centers of learning and commerce. The very concept of a cosmopolitan world, a world where different cultures could interact, compete, and blend, owes something to the world Alexander's campaigns brought into being. He was not trying to create that legacy. He was trying to conquer the world, to surpass Achilles and Heracles and every hero who had come before him. He succeeded at that, in his own terms. And then he died at 32, leaving behind a question that no one could answer. To the strongest, to the best. There is a moment that ancient sources describe from the last days of his illness that has stayed with historians and readers for centuries. His soldiers, the ordinary infantrymen, the veterans of Gaugamela and the Hydaspes and the Gedrosian Desert, were so worried about him that they demanded to see him. His generals relented, and the men filed past his bed one by one. He could not speak by then, but he looked at each of them. He acknowledged each of them with his eyes. These were men who had marched 20,000 miles with him, who had fought in the dust and heat and cold at the edge of the world, who had believed in him with a completeness that is difficult to fully comprehend from a distance of 2.5 millennia. And he looked at each of them. What he thought in those moments, no one recorded. Whether he felt the weight of what he had built and what he was leaving unfinished, whether he felt regret or satisfaction, or simply the confusion of a man dying too young to understand what his life had meant, we do not know. We cannot know. The ancient sources give us drama and symbolism, but the interior life of Alexander of Macedon is finally inaccessible to us. What we have instead is the record of what he did, and the long, complicated, extraordinary shadow it cast. He was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedon. He died in 323 BC in Babylon. In between, he crossed from Europe into Asia, defeated the greatest empire in the world, marched to the edge of India, and changed the shape of the ancient world permanently. He founded cities that are still inhabited today. He created conditions that shaped the transmission of philosophy, religion, and culture for centuries after his death. He also caused enormous suffering. He destroyed cities. He killed people who trusted him. He drove his army to the edge of destruction in a desert for reasons that are still debated. He built an empire with no succession plan and left it to be torn apart by the men he had trained. He was, in other words, human, ferociously, extraordinarily, catastrophically human. And that is perhaps the most important thing to say about him. The great men of history are not simple. They are not simply heroes or simply villains. They are people operating under enormous pressure, with enormous ambitions, in circumstances that would break most of us before breakfast. Alexander of Macedon was the most successful conqueror in the ancient world, and he left behind a legacy that is still being argued about, still being studied, still being felt in ways that most people never think about. That is what it means to change history, not to build something permanent. Nothing is permanent. But to set in motion a chain of consequences so large, so far-reaching, so deeply embedded in the fabric of what comes after, that the world cannot be understood without reckoning with what you did. Alexander understood this, at least in part. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted to surpass the heroes of legend. He wanted his name to last. It has lasted. If this story raised questions for you about what it actually means to build an empire, about how one person's ambition can reshape the world, about why great things so often collapse the moment the person holding them together is gone, then I think you're asking exactly the right questions. History rewards that kind of curiosity. If you want to go deeper, the next step is the world that came after Alexander, the Hellenistic kingdoms, the rise of Rome, and the long, strange process by which a Macedonian conqueror's legacy became the cultural foundation of the Western world. That story is coming. If this video gave you something to think about, leave a comment below with what surprised you most. The death of Parmenion, the collapse of the succession, the chain of consequences that runs from Alexander to the New Testament. I read every comment, and the best conversations on this channel happen down there. Subscribe if you want more history that actually tries to explain why things happened, not just that they happened, and share this with someone who thinks ancient history has nothing to say to the present. It has quite a lot to say. The CTA has already been written. What needs to happen here is not a new ending, but an expansion of the story itself. More depth, more texture, more of the historical fabric that a topic this large genuinely deserves. So let us go back inside the story, to the parts that were covered too quickly, and give them the weight they are owed. Consider what Alexander's world actually looked like from the inside, not from the elevated perspective of hindsight, where we can see the whole arc, but from the ground level, where the men living through it had no idea what was coming next. Take the city of Babylon, which Alexander entered in 331 BC, after the Battle of Gaugamela. This was one of the oldest and most magnificent cities in the world. Its walls were so thick, according to Herodotus, that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on top of them. Its hanging gardens, if they existed as described, which some historians now doubt, were counted among the wonders of the world. Its ziggurat, the great step temple to the god Marduk, rose above the flat Mesopotamian plain and could be seen from miles away. When Alexander rode in, the city did not resist. The Persian garrison withdrew. The Babylonian priests welcomed him. He made offerings to Marduk in the traditional Babylonian manner, presenting himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate king performing the proper religious duties. This was deliberate. Alexander understood, with a sophistication that surprises people who think of him only as a warrior, that conquered people are much easier to govern if they believe the new ruler respects their gods. He stayed in Babylon for a month, resting his army, reorganizing his administration, and absorbing the reality of what he had accomplished. He was 25 years old. He had just walked into one of the greatest cities in human history as its master, and then he moved on, because there was always somewhere further to go. This restlessness is one of the defining features of Alexander's psychology, and it is worth examining carefully. Ancient sources describe him as driven by pothos, a Greek word that means longing or yearning, a desire for something just beyond reach. It is a word the sources use specifically for his desire to go further, to cross the next river, to see what lay beyond the next mountain range. It was not simply military ambition, though it was that too. It was something more existential, a sense that stopping meant something had ended, that the meaning of his life was located in the forward movement itself. This matters because it helps explain a decision that has puzzled historians for generations. Why, after conquering Persia, did he keep going? He had achieved what he had set out to do. The Persian Empire was his. He could have stopped, consolidated, built. He had the wealth of the greatest empire in the world at his disposal. He had allies, administrators, and the loyalty of his army. Any reasonable political calculation would have said, stop here. Build something that will last. But Alexander was not operating on a reasonable political calculation. He was operating on something closer to a mythological imperative. Achilles had his glory. Heracles had his labors. Alexander needed his equivalent, something that would mark him as not merely great but unprecedented. And that required going further than anyone had gone before. The tragedy is that this same quality, the pothos, the relentless forward drive, is precisely what made it impossible for him to build something durable. An empire needs administration, law, settled institutions, a clear succession. It needs a ruler who is willing to stay in one place long enough to make the machinery of governance actually work. Alexander was never willing to do that. He was always already planning the next campaign. The relationship between Alexander and his soldiers deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it is one of the most psychologically complex aspects of his story. These were not professional soldiers in the modern sense, men who signed a contract and serve a term and then go home. Many of them had been with Alexander since the beginning, since the crossing into Asia in 334 BC. They had been away from home for a decade. Some of them had married local women in the territories they passed through. Some of them had children who had never seen Macedon. They were, in a very real sense, a society in motion, a moving city of soldiers, camp followers, administrators, scholars, and dependents that numbered in the hundreds of thousands by the later campaigns. Alexander understood this, and he worked to maintain the bond between himself and his men with considerable skill. He knew their names, or at least performed the knowledge of their names, which amounts to the same thing politically. He visited the wounded personally. He shared their hardships, or was seen to share them. There are famous stories of him refusing water during a desert march, when water was scarce, pouring out a helmet full that had been brought to him because there was not enough for everyone. Whether these stories are literally true or embellished in the retelling, they circulated among his soldiers and served their purpose. But the relationship was also under constant strain. The men grew tired. They grew homesick. They grew troubled by the changes they saw in Alexander. The Persian dress, the court ceremonial, the increasingly divine self-presentation. They had signed up to follow a Macedonian king. They were not entirely sure who they were following by the end. The mutiny at Opis in 324 BC, the year before Alexander's death, was the most serious rupture. Alexander announced that he intended to discharge his Macedonian veterans and replace them with Persian soldiers trained in Macedonian methods. His men were outraged. They had given him everything, and now they were being discarded in favor of the very people they had spent a decade defeating. The confrontation was ugly. Alexander, furious, had the ringleaders arrested and executed. He then withdrew into his quarters and refused to see anyone for 2 days. When he emerged, he gave a speech that ancient sources describe as deeply emotional. He reminded his men of everything they had achieved together, of everything Philip had built, and he had expanded, of the hardships they had shared. And then he dismissed them, telling them they could go home and tell people that they had abandoned their king. It worked. The veterans wept. They begged to be forgiven. The reconciliation was genuine, or at least genuine enough. Alexander held a great banquet of reconciliation, at which Macedonians and Persians ate together, and he prayed, according to the ancient sources, for harmony between the peoples of his empire. It is one of the most remarkable scenes in ancient history, a conqueror praying for the unity of the people he had conquered and the people who had done the conquering. Whether it was sincere or theatrical or both, It points towards something in Alexander's vision that was genuinely unusual for his time, a sense that the empire he was building was not simply a Macedonian possession, but something larger, something that transcended the ethnic categories he had been born into. He did not live long enough to see whether that vision could be made real. He died less than a year later. The physical toll of Alexander's campaigns on his body is something that tends to get underplayed in the heroic narrative, but it is worth confronting directly. He was wounded seriously multiple times. At the Granicus, he nearly had his skull split. At Issus, he was wounded in the thigh. At Gaza, an arrow went through his shoulder. In Central Asia, he took an arrow in the leg that shattered the bone. At the siege of a town called Mali in India, in what was perhaps his most reckless moment, he jumped alone over the walls of a besieged city and was shot through the chest by an arrow that pierced his lung. His men had to breach the wall to rescue him. He nearly died. His recovery took months. By the time he reached Babylon in 323 BC, he was carrying the accumulated damage of 13 years of combat. He was 32, but his body was older. The drinking that the ancient sources describe, and it was heavy by any standard, was not helping. The fever that killed him found a man who was, for all his apparent invincibility, physically depleted. There is something almost unbearable about this when you sit with it. The most successful conqueror in the ancient world, the man who had crossed deserts and mountains and rivers and stood at the edge of India, was undone not by an enemy army but by a microorganism in the Babylonian water supply. History is full of this kind of irony, but rarely is it quite so stark. The legacy question, what Alexander's conquests actually meant for the long run, is one that historians have been arguing about for 2,000 years, and it is worth spending a few more minutes on it, because the standard answers tend to be either too celebratory or too critical. The celebratory version says, Alexander spread Greek civilization, created a cosmopolitan world, founded cities, promoted learning, and set in motion the cultural synthesis that shaped the Roman Empire, and through it the modern West. This is true as far as it goes. The critical version says he was a conqueror who caused enormous death and suffering, who destroyed cultures as much as he spread them, and whose empire collapsed almost immediately, suggesting that the whole enterprise was more about personal glory than any coherent civilizational project. This is also true as far as it goes. The more honest answer is that both are true simultaneously, and the discomfort of holding both at once is actually the historically accurate position. Great historical forces are rarely clean. The same campaigns that spread Greek philosophy and founded the Library of Alexandria also killed hundreds of thousands of people and enslaved thousands more. The same man who wept over Darius's body and treated Porus with generous respect also destroyed Thebes and massacred the defenders of Tyre. What the Hellenistic world that emerged from Alexander's conquests actually gave the world was not a utopia of cultural harmony. It was something messier and more interesting. A zone of intense cultural contact and competition, where ideas from different traditions collided and produced new things that none of the contributing traditions could have produced alone. The Stoic philosophy that would shape Roman ethics and eventually Christian theology emerged from this collision. The mathematical and scientific advances of Hellenistic Alexandria emerged from it. The religious syncretism that produced new cults and eventually helped create the conditions for the spread of monotheism emerged from it. None of this was planned. All of it was, in some sense, a consequence of one young man's refusal to stop moving. There is a final thought worth sitting with as this story closes. Alexander is one of a small number of historical figures, Caesar, Napoleon, Genghis Khan, whose names have become shorthand for a certain kind of ambition and achievement. We use the word Alexandrian to describe a particular kind of greatness. Military academies study his tactics. His campaigns are taught in business schools as models of logistics and leadership. His name appears in the founding myths of dozens of cultures across a vast swath of the world, from Egypt to Pakistan, each of which has its own version of who he was and what he meant. In the Persian and Islamic traditions, he appears as Iskandar Dul-Qarnayn, Alexander the Two-Horned, a figure of legend and sometimes of prophecy. In the Ethiopian tradition, he is a hero king. In medieval European romances, he is a figure of chivalry. Each culture that his conquests touched has, over the centuries, made him into something that reflects its own values and concerns. This is what happens to figures who genuinely change the world. They stop being historical individuals and become something larger, a canvas onto which later generations project their own ideas about power, ambition, greatness, and the cost of both. The real Alexander, the man who was afraid of his father's shadow, who loved Homer and Hephaestion and the forward movement of the campaign, who killed Cleotus and wept for it, who prayed for harmony between peoples and died before he could see whether it was possible, that man is still there, underneath the legend. If you look carefully enough at the sources, he is worth looking for. Not because he was a hero, and not because he was a villain, but because he was one of the most consequential human beings who ever lived. And understanding him, really understanding him, with all the contradictions intact, tells us something important about what human beings are capable of, for good and for ill. That is why history matters, not as a collection of dates and battles and names, but as a record of what people actually did when they were given extraordinary circumstances and extraordinary power. What they chose, what it cost, what it made possible that would not otherwise have been possible. Alexander chose to keep moving. It cost him everything, eventually, and it made possible a world that neither he nor anyone else could fully have imagined. If this story made Alexander feel real to you, not as a statue or a legend, but as an actual person navigating impossible circumstances, then leave a comment below telling me which moment hit hardest. The scene at the Hyphasis River, where his army finally refused to go further. The death of Cleotus. The soldiers filing past his bed at the end. Those conversations in the comments are where this channel comes alive, and I read every one of them. If you want to follow where the story goes next, into the wars of the successors, the rise of Rome, and the long afterlife of the Hellenistic world, subscribe so you do not miss it. And if you know someone who thinks ancient history is just memorizing dates, share this with them. It is not about the dates. It never was.